The heavy iron gates of the Marston estate didn't creak. They groaned under the weight of a bolt cutter's bite. Rebecca stood on the porch, her breath hitching as a fleet of black SUVs tore through the morning mist, their tires shredding the manicured gravel. In the lead, Jack Holt, the only man she trusted with the winery's secrets, stepped out. Not with a greeting, but with a stack of documents and a team of strangers who began marking her grandfather's vines with neon plastic tape. When she reached for the door to her own laboratory, a security guard she'd never seen before blocked her path, his hand resting heavy on a holster. Jack didn't look up from his phone as he walked past her, his voice devoid of the warmth that had been there only last night. "The locks have already been changed, Rebecca. It's better if you don't make a scene in front of the new owners." Behind him, a massive yellow bulldozer roared to life at the edge of the oldest vineyard, its steel blade lowering toward the century-old roots. As the first vine snapped with a sound like a breaking bone, Rebecca realized the papers she had signed in desperation weren't a lifeline. They were a death warrant for everything she loved. Rebecca Marston gripped the edges of the massive oak desk, her knuckles turning a ghostly white against the dark, polished wood. Before her lay the wreckage of a legacy. Stacks of audit reports bleeding with red ink. The harsh glow of the desk lamp carved out islands of light in the dim office, illuminating columns of figures where debit crushed credit with merciless weight. A scent of old paper and stale dust hung in the air. But to Rebecca, it carried the stench of rot. Her fingers trembled as she flipped to the section detailing the mortgaged vineyards. Each number felt like a physical blow, a rhythmic strike confirming the unthinkable. The coffers sat empty. The accounts remained frozen. She buried her face in her palms, the cold sweat slicking her spine. The family estate, built stone by stone over decades, had become a house of cards swaying in a rising gale. The silence of the valley shattered under the crunch of gravel as a fleet of heavy black SUVs crested the ridge. 3 men stepped out, their movements synchronized, clad in charcoal suits that looked as rigid as armor. Their faces remained granite masks, devoid of the warmth usually found in the soil of Napa. The lead representative of the agri-conglomerate marched toward the house, slamming a glossy folder onto the hood of his vehicle. With a sharp flick of his wrist, he beckoned Rebecca. His voice droned with the mechanical indifference of a grape crusher, flat and rhythmic. He named a figure so insulting it wouldn't cover the cost of the estate's perimeter fence. Then let a jagged smirk pull at his lips. Rebecca watched his eyes roam over the rows of vines, scanning them not for beauty, but for yield. He tapped a gold pen against the paper, a rhythmic ticking that signaled he was waiting for her spirit to snap. Down in the old cellar, the air held a heavy, vaulted silence, broken only by the rhythmic plink of condensation hitting the stone floor. Rebecca stood beside a massive oak barrel, drawing in the sharp, fermented tang of must and damp rock. The sound of Jack Holt's boots echoed against the walls as he emerged from the shadows of a distant rack. A beam of light caught the sharp line of his jaw and the intensity in his gray eyes. Rebecca pressed her palms against the cool wood of the cask, trying to steady the tremors in her knees. Jack stopped a mere foot away, his presence filling the narrow aisle. In the dimness, Rebecca saw a flicker of something resembling hope in his gaze. He placed his hand on the barrel right next to her fingers, his voice a low vibration. He promised her right then that they would not let the history of her ancestors dissolve into the dirt. Jack began to pace the length of the cellar, his hands carving shapes in the air as he spun visions of a resurrected estate. He spoke of a private investment fund, a deep reservoir of capital ready to drench the parched soil of the Marston vineyards with millions. Rebecca tracked his every movement, clinging to his words about heritage and the sanctity of tradition. He leaned in closer, the scent of his expensive cologne, sharp citrus and sandalwood, mingling with the earthy aroma of aging wine. Jack swore the terms of the deal would ensure she kept the deciding vote in all matters. She watched him square his shoulders, looking every bit the protector who had already driven the vultures from the gate. His confidence seeped into her, a warm current that made her heart hammer with a sudden, desperate rhythm. The peace of the courtyard died in a scream of tires and the splintering of the gate. 3 men in heavy leather jackets surged onto the property, their hands gripped around iron bars and their boots heavy on the stone. Rebecca shrieked as one of the collectors swung a length of pipe into a decorative terracotta vase, exploding the ceramic into a spray of red shards. The men barked insults, their voices a discordant roar that echoed off the manor walls. Rebecca watched in horror as one of the thugs reached for a trellis, ripping a young vine from its support and grinding the tender leaves into the mud beneath his heel. Slime and dirt splattered against the white facade of the mansion. When the sound of shattering glass erupted from the conservatory, Rebecca froze. These men weren't just looking for money. They were methodically dismantling the beauty she had believed was sacred. The massive silhouettes of the collectors shifted, blocking every exit from the main house. They formed a living wall of muscle and malice. Rebecca backed toward the staircase, the sound of a heavy iron bolt sliding home on the front door, echoing through the hall like a gunshot. Another man closed the distance, his breath a foul mix of cheap tobacco and stale liquor. He brandished a fistful of overdue notices in her face, his voice a guttural demand for immediate payment. Through the window, Rebecca saw the third man take his station at the back stairs, severing her final route of escape. The air in the foyer grew thick, suffocating. Every time she opened her mouth to protest, the men drowned her out with jagged laughter and fresh threats. Rebecca retreated into the shadows beneath the stairs, her fingers fumbling with her phone. The screen's glow felt blinding in the dim nook. She scrolled frantically until she found Jack's number, her breath coming in ragged hitches. When he finally picked up, she spoke in a frantic whisper, the words tumbling out as she described the chaos unfolding just feet away. A loud crash from the hall, another heirloom destroyed, made her curl into a tighter ball. Jack's voice on the other end remained steady, a cool anchor in the middle of her panic. She pressed the phone to her ear so hard it left a red mark on her skin, clinging to his promise that he was on his way to save her. The rhythmic thrum of a high-end engine and the sharp skid of tires announced Jack's arrival. He burst through the door, his shoulders knocking the collectors aside as he made a straight line for Rebecca. He wrapped his arms around her, shielding her small frame from the predatory stares of the thugs. Rebecca felt the violent shaking of her limbs begin to subside under his touch. Jack cast a frigid look at the men, and for a second, they actually recoiled. He reached into the inner pocket of his blazer and pulled out a thick, leather-bound folder, brandishing it like a weapon. In that moment, Jack appeared to Rebecca as the only solid thing in a world turned to liquid, the only force capable of halting the nightmare. With a sharp slap, Jack dropped the packet of documents onto the dining table, clearing a space amidst the shards of broken crystal. He flipped through the pages with practiced ease, his fingers stabbing at the lines designated for signatures. He spoke with a rapid-fire intensity, insisting that this contract was the only way to trigger an immediate wire transfer and halt the seizure of the estate. Rebecca stared at the dense blocks of legalese. The words blurred into a gray haze before her eyes. Jack slid a pen toward her, his fingers grazing her skin for a fleeting second. Behind him, the collectors lingered, shifting their weight and cracking their knuckles in a silent, rhythmic threat. Jack leaned over her, his voice urgent, stating there was no time left to think. She had to act now. The shouts of the men in the hall grew more aggressive. One began to rhythmically thrum his fist against the wall beside the door. Rebecca turned the pages of the contract with trembling hands, trying to snatch the meaning from the jargon. Jack stood over her, his shadow stretching across the paper and swallowing the text. He prodded her, his voice emphasizing the clauses regarding immediate financial relief. Rebecca's heart climbed into her throat, making it hard to breathe, let alone focus. Jack's hand reached out, gently but firmly guiding hers toward the bottom of the page. All she could see was the stark white of the paper and the empty signature line, while the pressure from Jack's presence became a physical weight she couldn't push back. Rebecca hovered the pen over the line, her eyes seeking Jack's for one last confirmation. He gave a sharp, encouraging nod, whispering that this was a mere formality, a shield to deflect the creditor's blades. She drew a jagged breath and scrawled her name across the final page. The ink bit into the paper, sealing the pact. A strange sense of hollowed-out exhaustion washed over her, as if the ink had been drawn from her own veins. Jack immediately flipped to the next section, pointing to more empty fields. She continued to sign, page after page, her trust in him absolute. She believed that this single act would restore her peace and keep the Marston name etched into the valley. The moment the final signature hit the paper, the collectors fell silent. They turned as one and marched out of the house with military precision, not uttering another word. Rebecca watched them go, stunned by the abruptness of the change. Jack moved just as quickly, gathering the original contracts and tucking them into his folder. He didn't look at her. His movements had turned dry and clinical. Rebecca tried to find her voice to ask a question, but Jack was already halfway to the door, giving only a curt nod over his shoulder. She stood in the center of the wrecked room, listening to the fading roar of his engine. In the silence that followed, a deep chill seeped under her skin, and she realized the house was now entirely empty, and she was utterly alone. The next morning, Rebecca threw open the shutters and flinched at the violent clang of metal hitting metal. A convoy of heavy trucks sat idling at the manor gates, their diesel engines belching blue smoke that curdled the morning air. Men in neon orange coveralls bearing the AgriCorp logo swarmed the grounds, dropping ramps and rolling out hulking machinery still slick with factory grease. She watched as the massive tires pulverized the decorative lawn into a muddy pulp. The whine of hydraulics drowned out the birds, and the sharp stench of fuel replaced the scent of the vines. Rebecca gripped the windowsill, watching these strangers haul crates of equipment into the historic winery, as if they already owned the stones. Rebecca sprinted down the path, throwing herself in front of a broad-shouldered foreman wearing a hard hat. The man didn't even slow down. He simply shoved a tablet toward her. Clipped to it was a document featuring Jack's sprawling signature and a corporate seal that looked like a brand on the estate's hide. The order, written in dry, skeletal prose, mandated a total inventory of every asset, moving or fixed. The foreman spat on the gravel and signaled his crew to break the locks on the storage sheds. Rebecca stared at the printed letters, the icy clarity of the legal language stripping away her authority over her own soil. Inside the main hall, Rebecca collided with a wall of boxes and filing cabinets. Jack sat at the massive oak desk, the desk where only Marstons had sat for a century. He didn't look up. His fingers tapped a frantic rhythm on a laptop keyboard, while a secretary's monotone voice droned from a speakerphone. Rebecca watched Jack carelessly shove a family heirloom inkwell to the edge of the desk to make room for his coffee. The secretary nodded at Jack's every word, scribbling down orders to change the security codes. Rebecca noticed Jack's personal files already lined the shelves, systematically pushing her life into the shadows of the room. Rebecca slammed her palms onto the desk, her voice cracking as she demanded an explanation. Jack leaned back slowly, his eyes as cold as a mountain lake, pinning her in place. He tapped a gold ring against the wood, informing her that operational control had shifted to the AgriCorp board of directors. He slid a restructuring chart across the desk. Her name was nowhere near the decision-making tier. His voice remained flat, clinical, as he explained that her deciding vote had been nullified by a subclause regarding crisis management. Rebecca felt the floor tilt beneath her. She turned toward her laboratory, seeking the familiar comfort of her microscopes and glass. But a wall of black fabric blocked her path. A security guard, his uniform smelling of starch and gun oil, stood firm, a badge glinting on his chest. A fresh, "No unauthorized entry" sticker had been slapped over the lab door. The guard rested a hand on his holster and told her that access to the technical zone was now restricted to personnel with Tier 1 clearance. Through the glass, Rebecca saw strangers in white coats shifting her reagents. Every word the guard spoke felt like a sentence of exile. Rebecca ran toward the slopes, her lungs burning as a sharp, acrid smell hit her. Tractors with high-pressure sprayers crawled through the rows of Cabernet, belching clouds of a sickly yellow mist. She watched the aggressive chemicals settle on the leaves, which began to curl almost instantly. These toxins had been banned by the Marstons for decades. The workers, hidden behind respirators, ignored her screams, continuing to saturate the earth with poison to force a growth spurt. Rebecca pressed a cloth to her mouth, watching the ecological standards of her grandfather turn to poison dust under the heavy tires. Near the edge of the south field, she found the head agronomist, his face a mask of gray exhaustion. He pointed to a line of trucks being loaded with the prime clusters usually reserved for the estate's private labels. In a low, defeated voice, he told her that Jack had rerouted the harvest. The elite grapes were being sent to industrial plants to be turned into cheap, bulk concentrate. She saw the juice from the overcrushed berries leaking onto the asphalt, leaving sticky, dark trails. Jack was liquidating years of craftsmanship for a quick spike in the ledger. She touched a shriveled grape, realizing the high culture of Marston winemaking was being bled out on this dusty road. Rebecca pulled out her phone, her thumb hovering over the banking app. But the screen flared with a red error message. She tried again, but the system informed her that all accounts, personal and corporate, were locked. A cold dread settled in her marrow. An automated email sat in her inbox, detailing a financial stabilization procedure initiated by Jack Holt, freezing all assets until further notice. She stared at the zero balance, realizing Jack hadn't just taken her power. He had taken her ability to fight back. She couldn't even afford a lawyer to scream for her. The Manor's dining room was unnervingly quiet, save for the muffled sound of a sob. Rebecca found the housekeeper sitting on the edge of a chair, twisting her apron into knots. The woman looked up with red-rimmed eyes and told Rebecca that Jack had just signed the termination papers for half the staff. People who had worked these vines for 30 years were being tossed out without a cent of severance. Rebecca saw the piles of discarded keys on the floor and the meager final checks. Jack was cutting overhead, excising the very heart of the estate. Rebecca reached out to the woman, feeling the weight of their collective helplessness. Rebecca burst into the office, cutting off Jack's phone call. She screamed about betrayal, about the honor of the land. But Jack's expression didn't even flicker. He stood up slowly, adjusting his cuffs with a smirk. He called the Marston traditions unprofitable ballast, a weight that was dragging the business into the dirt. She saw nothing in his eyes but the cold calculation of a machine. He spoke of margins and market share while she realized that to him, the estate was just a lemon to be squeezed dry and discarded. A lawyer from AgriCorp entered the room, carrying a thin, ominous folder. He began to read from the contract Rebecca had signed under the shadow of the collectors. He highlighted the fine print, the tiny, jagged letters that officially demoted her to a consultant observer with zero authority over business processes. Rebecca looked at her own signatures. They looked like a confession. Jack nodded with satisfaction, watching the legal trap snap shut. She realized she was now a guest in her own home, forced to watch the people she hated destroy everything she loved. Rebecca stepped out onto the balcony as the sun began to sink into a bruise-colored sky. Below, the vineyards were a scene of carnage. Machines tore at the soil, and workers ripped out the old trellises to make room for high-density planting. She watched the shadows stretch over the mangled landscape, making it look like a graveyard. Jack stood in the center of the chaos, barking orders into a radio, his silhouette a black tear in the horizon. The soul was being sucked out of the estate, replaced by the rhythmic, heartless throb of industry. The Marston legacy was dying, and she was the only one left to witness the funeral. Rebecca froze at the edge of Jack's desk when a stray draft flipped the top page of his ledger. Instead of the expected irrigation schedules, sharp black lines of engineering blueprints stared back at her. In place of the manor and the rolling hills of the estate, she saw the cold, gray rectangles of massive shipping terminals. She traced the lines of new access roads for semi-trucks, which sliced right through the heart of the elite Cabernet sections. The blueprints smelled of fresh ammonia and ink, a chemical death sentence for the land. She touched the mark for Loading Zone 4, which sat exactly where the family's cypress grove stood. The architect's precision had turned a living ecosystem into a flat, concrete platform. The music on the terrace was a roar, drowning out the clink of crystal as Jack approached her with a flute of champagne. The guests swirled in silk and linen, celebrating a harvest that wasn't theirs. But Jack leaned in close, his breath smelling of expensive cognac. He let out a short, jagged laugh, pointing toward the sun setting over the valley. He hissed that wine was just sentimental dust, and the real gold was buried in the logistics network AgriCorp was building. Rebecca watched his eyes catch the light, filled with a predatory hunger. He promised her that within a month, not a single vine would remain. Just a smooth, profitable sea of asphalt. Rebecca slipped into the shadows of the stone colonnade, watching Jack move toward the buffet, laughing with a group of investors. Once his broad back was turned, she ducked into the side corridor. She pulled her old keyring from her pocket, the copper ring cold against her palm. The lock to Jack's office gave way, with a faint, oily click that was lost under the bursts of laughter from the party. She slid inside, the room smelling of stale cigars and the hum of the server rack. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she eased the heavy door shut, disappearing into the darkness of his lair. She dropped to her knees in front of the safe, hidden behind the rosewood paneling. Her fingers spun the dial, a rhythmic clicking as she recalled the code she'd seen him punch in with arrogant carelessness. The mechanism gave way, and the heavy door swung open to reveal a stack of blue-bound documents. She snatched a page with the security firm's logo and saw a payment schedule signed by Jack a day before the collectors arrived. Under Services, it listed the staged intimidation by recovery agents. Rebecca gripped the paper, staring at the signatures of the actors Jack had hired to terrorize her. The horror of that night had been bought and paid for by the man she had called a friend. The heavy thud of boots on the carpet made Rebecca spin around, but she was too slow. The head of security burst into the room, his face flushed a dark red under the desk lamp. He lunged, his fingers like iron clamps as they crushed her wrists. The folder containing the secret agreement slipped, but she caught it against her chest. He yanked her toward him, twisting her arm until she gasped. She could smell the sweat and cheap cologne on him as he leaned over her, his weight intended to pin her down and strip the evidence of Jack's betrayal from her hands. Rebecca's fingers brushed against a heavy bronze paperweight shaped like a cluster of grapes on the edge of the desk. Without a thought, she swung the metal with everything she had, slamming it down onto the security chief's knuckles. A sickening crack echoed in the room, and the man roared, his grip breaking. Rebecca didn't wait. She bolted for the door, clutching the document so tightly the paper sliced into her skin. She tore down the hallway, her heels a frantic rhythm on the parquet, the sound of the man's curses and heavy breathing right behind her. Adrenaline turned the world into a blur of color and light as she ran for her life. She burst onto the terrace, the glare of the spotlights blinding her as she shoved through the crowd of well-dressed guests. Champagne splashed onto her dress, but she kept moving. Ahead, Jack was adjusting his tie in front of a bank of television cameras, preparing for his big moment. She saw the red tally lights and the shimmer of news lenses. She tried to scream, but the noise of the crowd swallowed her voice. She fought her way through the ring of investors, her hair a wild mess, the crumpled papers held aloft. Jack saw her then, and his practiced smile tightened into a thin, lethal line. Jack stepped forward, ignoring her, and gripped the microphone. His voice, amplified to a roar, rolled over the valley, announcing a new era under the AgriCorp banner. He spoke the words with a chilling finality, declaring the Marston estate brand liquidated, an obsolete relic. The investors erupted into applause, their clapping a rhythmic thud that sounded like nails being driven into a coffin. Behind him, a massive screen flickered to life, showing the logo for the new logistics hub. Jack stood in the center of the light, a man transformed, while the Marston name was officially scrubbed from the valley. Rebecca lunged for the microphone, her arm outstretched with the documents. But two of Jack's guards appeared like stone walls in her path. They seized her elbows in a synchronized move, lifting her off her feet. She felt herself being shoved back toward the edge of the stone balustrade, where the drop into the dark vineyards yawned behind her. The guards worked in silence, a human shield between her and the cameras. She could see nothing but the backs of their dark suits. She struggled, but the cold stone of the railing bit into her spine, and all she could see was Jack's triumphant face across the terrace. Jack signaled the press to hold and walked right up to her. He leaned in so close, his breath tickled her ear, his face hidden from the cameras by the guard's broad shoulders. He whispered in a voice of pure ice that one phone call would turn her into a thief, a common criminal who had stolen corporate secrets. He promised her that a prison cell would be her new home for years if she dared to show those papers. She saw the absolute certainty in his eyes. He squeezed her arm, a final, sharp warning. Rebecca felt her strength fail, her fingers loosening on the proof she held. At a signal from Jack, floodlights on the roof swiveled, illuminating a crew of workers on the scaffolding. Rebecca watched in horror as a crane hook snagged the hand-forged Marston sign. With a scream of tearing metal, the crest her great-grandfather had built was ripped from the stone. The cameras broadcast it live, the family legacy being lowered into a trash trailer. She heard the crash of glass as a letter hit the pavement. Jack smiled at his phone, watching the AgriCorp stock ticker climb. Each movement of the crane was a rhythmic strike against her heart, performed for a cheering crowd. Rebecca stood frozen as the camera flashes turned the world into a white void. The journalists were already turning away, chasing Jack for quotes about the future of the valley. She felt the folders slip from her numb fingers, the pages scattering across the stone wet with spilled wine. No one looked at her. She was already a ghost on her own land. Jack's legal web had worked, turning her into a stranger. She looked at the empty scar on the building where her name had been, realizing the Marston story had reached its final, bitter page. Rebecca surged forward, a desperate bolt that carried her through the knot of reporters smelling of stale coffee and rain. She caught a photographer's shoulder with her elbow and snatched the microphone right out of Jack's hand. The cold metal felt like a lightning rod, and the speakers shrieked with a jagged burst of feedback. She stood there, pinned by the red eyes of the video cameras, which now feasted on every line of her rage-tightened face. Jack took a sharp step back, his mouth hanging open in a silent, stunned protest, as she adjusted the stand and locked the gaze of the crowd. Her voice vibrated through the air, a low hum that settled over the valley. She smoothed out the crumpled sheets of paper, revealing the chemical formulas for the herbicides Jack was dumping into the soil. She read the names of the toxins, her voice a rhythmic hammer, describing how the land was being murdered to create a stable base for concrete. The wind carried the scent of exhaust from the idling trucks, and she pointed to the blueprints where warehouses replaced the cellars. She saw the faces of the local farmers turn to stone. The investors began to shift, their eyes darting away from the evidence she brandished before the lenses. Jack lunged, his fingers clawing at the microphone stand to silence her. Rebecca spun away from his grasp, thrusting the report with his bold signature into the light. The ink of his name shimmered under the spots, a permanent record of his order to kill the ecosystem. She heard a low growl rise from the neighboring winemakers, a sound that sharpened into angry shouts. Jack was breathing hard now, sweat slicking his forehead, while she continued to feed the cameras the truth. The crowd surged toward the stage, and she felt the protective circle of money around Jack begin to crumble. Rebecca drew a long, steady breath, looking straight into Jack's blown-out pupil. She announced her resignation from the board, the words hitting like a physical strike. She pulled a heavy ring of keys from her pocket, the metal still warm from her skin. With a sharp, ringing clatter, she hurled them onto the stone at Jack's feet. They skittered across the pavement, scratching the surface before coming to rest near his polished shoes. Useless junk. She watched him freeze, unable to pick up the symbol of his hollow victory while the cameras recorded his shame. As the reporters swarmed Jack with a hail of questions, and the flashes turned the terrace into a strobe-lit nightmare, Rebecca ducked behind the guards. She moved with a silent, fluid grace, using the confusion as the security team tried to hold back the surging farmers. She slipped into the deep shadows of the boxwood hedge, where the scent of roses fought the smell of damp earth. Her boots were silent on the gravel. She rounded the main house, heading for the old, forgotten wing where a vault lay hidden, a place Jack's greed had made him overlook. She burst into the greenhouse, the air a thick, humid weight. She dropped to her knees in the corner where the oldest vines grew and drove a garden knife into the dark soil. Her fingers found the gnarled, stubborn roots of the mother vine, the one her grandfather had planted after the war. She carefully took 5 cuttings, the sticky sap staining her palms. She wrapped the saplings in a piece of wet burlap, clenching them to her chest. In these fragile sticks, she felt a pulse of life that Jack's chemicals hadn't reached. In her office, the room was a wreck, but she moved toward the heavy desk, already tagged with a corporate inventory number. She hit the hidden lever beneath the drawer, and a secret compartment slid out with a faint hiss. She grabbed the old book, its leather cover smelling of vanilla and oak. On the yellowed pages, she saw the elegant script of her ancestors, the secrets of the blend and the timing of the press. She tucked the manuscript under her coat, the rough leather warming her side. She had the foundation now, a world Jack's lawyers couldn't touch. Rebecca reached the gates, but Jack's black silhouette blocked the path of her truck. He slammed his hands onto the hood, his face twisted, a radio clutched in his fist. He screamed about intellectual property, demanding she hand over the book and the vines. She saw 2 guards closing in behind him, handcuffs glinting in their hands. Jack hissed that he would grind her into the dirt for this. She gripped the steering wheel, looking at him through the dust on the glass, her jaw set like stone. She rolled down the window and met his eyes with a terrifying, flat calm. She told him he could own the dirt, the concrete, and the rusted pipes, but he could never buy the taste of the wine. She let out a short, sharp laugh as he turned a deep, bruised red. She told him that the craft and the memory of the land didn't come with a contract. Jack tried to bark a response, but she cut him off, stating that without her, this estate was just a graveyard. He recoiled as if she'd struck him. She slammed the truck into gear, the engine giving a guttural roar. Jack had to dive out of the way to avoid the heavy tires. She floored it, gravel spraying from the wheels and coating his shoes in gray dust. She tore through the gates, catching a glimpse of the family sign lying in the ditch. In the mirror, Jack was a shrinking speck, waving his arms amidst a swarm of frantic lawyers. She looked only ahead, where the highway vanished into the morning fog, leaving the ruins behind. She pulled over at the very crest of the hill, where the Marston land ended. She stepped out, the cold wind biting at her face and bringing the scent of wet grass. The first light of dawn turned the valley a bloody red, revealing the scars on the estate, the ripped-out vines and the gray patches of the new warehouses. She saw the vultures circling over the house. The place belonged to the spreadsheets now. She turned away from the wreckage, the old pain in her chest hardening into a cold, sharp resolve to begin again. Rebecca climbed back into the cab and pulled the bundle of saplings and the recipe book to her chest. The burlap was rough against her skin, and the leather binding felt like the beating heart of her family. She felt a strange, soaring freedom. She had no house, no money, but she had the one thing Jack could never kill. She breathed in the smell of the earth clinging to the roots, a scent that gave her strength. She turned the key, ready to find a new valley where the Marston vine could grow in soil that wasn't for sale. The truck pulled away, carrying the living legacy into the mist.